Wade Stephen Wilson be sentenced as follows. Count 1, first-degree murder of Kristine Melton. The defendant is hereby sentenced to death. Count 2, grand theft of a motor vehicle. The defendant is sentenced to 5 years imprisonment in the Florida Department of Corrections. Count 3, battery. The defendant is hereby sentenced to 364 days in the Lee County Jail. Count 4, first-degree murder of Diane Ruiz. The defendant is hereby sentenced to death. Count 5, the burglary of a dwelling. The defendant is hereby sentenced to 15 years imprisonment in the Florida Department of Corrections. Count 6, petty theft. The defendant is hereby sentenced to 364 days in Lee County Jail. The defendant is given credit for all time served on this case on all counts. All counts are to run concurrent with each other, meaning at the same time. All statutorily
Wade
mandated
Wilson,
fines, fees, and costs as
a tale of cold-blooded murders. Wade Wilson, a Florida man, became notorious as the Deadpool killer following a gruesome series of events in October 2019. Wilson's crimes shocked the community and the nation, not only due to the brutality of the acts, but also because of the apparent randomness and lack of motive behind them. His victims, Kristine Melton and Diane Ruiz, both met tragic and violent ends at Wilson's hands, with their deaths occurring within a mere 24 hours of each other. The first victim, Kristine Melton, encountered Wilson in a local bar on October 7th, 2019. The two spent the night together, but by the following morning, what had started as a casual encounter took a deadly turn. Wilson strangled Melton in her own home before stealing her car. This vehicle would later be used in the murder of his second victim, Diane Ruiz. Later that day, Wilson came across Diane Ruiz, who was walking home from her job. Under the guise of needing directions, Wilson lured Ruiz into the car he had stolen from Melton. What happened next was a sequence of events that horrified even seasoned law enforcement officers. Wilson strangled Ruiz and then, in a final act of depravity, dumped her body in a remote location and repeatedly ran over her with the car until she was unrecognizable. The trial that followed Wilson's arrest was a long and emotionally charged affair. Prosecutors presented a chilling case, arguing that Wilson's murders were not crimes of passion, nor were they financially or personally motivated. Instead, they were simply acts of violence for violence's sake.
In this case, the totality of the circumstances indicates the defendant, with premeditation, beat and strangled Kristine Melton in her home before stealing her vehicle and driving to meet his girlfriend, Melissa Montanez. After Montanez refused to get into the car with him, the defendant battered her in broad daylight. The defendant told law enforcement, when Ms. Montanez managed to flee from the defendant, he fled the scene and drove back to Cape Coral, where he decided that he would murder another person. He saw Diane Ruiz walking to work and pulled over, pretending to ask for directions. She got into the car to provide directions, but the defendant strangled her when she tried to exit. He then drove to an empty lot, strangling her into unconsciousness at least one additional time on the way there. When she tried to flee from the car, he drove over her at least one time, inflicting mortal injuries to her spine, ribs, and neck. The evidence showed that both murders were heinous, atrocious, and cruel, and that the second murder was cold, calculated, and premeditated. The defendant inflicted serious physical and emotional pain to the victims. Moreover, the defendant committed the murders while on probation for prior felony convictions, and he committed 2 first-degree murders contemporaneously with each other and with grand theft of a motor vehicle, battery, and burglary of a dwelling.
This point was driven home by Assistant State Attorney Andreas Gardner, who described the murders as the ultimate expression of life slipping away, with strangulation being a method that requires direct and prolonged physical contact, making it a particularly intimate and brutal form of killing. Wilson's defense team faced an uphill battle. They did not contest his guilt. Instead, they sought to explain his actions by pointing to a history of drug abuse and resultant brain damage. They argued that Wilson was not in his right mind during the killings, suggesting that his capacity for premeditation was compromised by his drug-fueled state.
There were no statutory mitigating circumstances that were established, but the court considered the non-statutory mitigating circumstances presented by the defendant. Out of 13 enumerated non-statutory mitigating factors, the court found that 10 had been established. Out of those established, 6 were given little weight. The totality of the mitigating circumstances indicates that the defendant suffers from drug use from a young age, along with undiagnosed and untreated mental health issues of some kind. He felt abandoned by his biological parents, but had a devoted adoptive family who raised him in a supportive and loving environment. Defendant did not resist law enforcement when arrested and confessed fully to both murders. The court has further considered giving great weight to the advisory verdict of the jury, who recommended that the death penalty be.
Wilson's adoptive parents also made a plea for his life, writing to the court in hopes of sparing him the death penalty. They described their son as a troubled individual who had lost his way but was not beyond redemption. However, the jury was not swayed by these arguments. The horror of Wilson's crimes, combined with his apparent lack of remorse, led to a swift conviction on 2 counts of first-degree murder, among other charges. The death penalty was soon on the table, and the courtroom drama intensified as the sentencing phase approached. During this phase, the prosecution and defense presented their final arguments. The prosecution emphasized the sheer brutality of the murders, portraying Wilson as a remorseless killer who posed an ongoing threat to society. They pointed to his jailhouse interviews, where Wilson reportedly expressed no regret for his actions and even suggested he would commit the crimes again if given the chance. This chilling admission further solidified the prosecution's case that Wilson was beyond rehabilitation and deserved the ultimate punishment.
Imposed by a vote of 9-3 on count 1 for the murder of Kristine Melton and a vote of 10-2 on count 4 for the murder of Diane Ruiz. The court recognizes that there is no mathematical formula for considering the aggravating and mitigating factors. It is not enough to weigh the number of aggravators against the number of mitigators. The court carefully considered the nature and quality of each aggravator and mitigator. Having reviewed all of the aggravating factors proven beyond a reasonable doubt and all of the mitigating circumstances reasonably established by the evidence, the court finds that the aggravating factors greatly outweigh mitigating circumstances. Given the facts of the case, nothing in defendant's background or mental state would suggest that a death sentence is inappropriate. This court's review of other reported capital cases has led the court to conclude that the death penalty is not disproportionate in this case. Under the totality of the circumstances and evidence, the court finds no basis to override the jury's verdict. The totality of the circumstances warrants that the defendant, Wade Stephen Wilson, be sentenced to death for each count of first-degree murder. Accordingly, it is ordered and adjudged that the defendant, Wade Stephen Wilson, be sentenced as follows. Count 1, first-degree murder of Kristine Melton. The defendant is hereby sentenced to death. Count 2, grand theft of a motor vehicle. The defendant is sentenced to 5 years imprisonment in the Florida Department of Corrections. Count 3, battery. The defendant is hereby sentenced to 364 days in the Lee County Jail. Count 4, first-degree murder of Diane Ruiz. The defendant is hereby sentenced to death. Count 5, the burglary of a dwelling. The defendant is hereby sentenced to 15 years imprisonment in the Florida Department of Corrections. Count 6, petty theft. The defendant is hereby sentenced to 364 days in the Lee County Jail. The defendant is given credit for all time served on this case on all counts. All counts are to run concurrent with each other, meaning at the same time. All statutorily mandated fines, fees, and costs as announced on the record are imposed, and the defendant is committed to the custody of the Department of Corrections for execution of this sentence as provided by law.
On the other hand, Wilson's defense team continued to argue that his actions were the result of impaired judgment due to his drug addiction and psychological issues. They pleaded with the jury to consider these factors and to opt for a life sentence rather than the death penalty. Yet these arguments did little to mitigate the horror of the crimes in the eyes of the jury, and the death sentence was ultimately handed down. The sentencing marked the end of a nearly 5-year legal saga that had captivated the local community and drawn widespread media attention. For the families of Kristine Melton and Diane Ruiz, The verdict brought a sense of closure, though it could never fully heal the wounds left by such senseless violence. As Wilson awaits execution, his case continues to be a topic of discussion, particularly regarding the broader issues it raises about mental health, the criminal justice system, and the nature of evil. Wilson's story is a stark reminder of the depths of human depravity and the devastating impact it can have on innocent lives,